phrase statistical catfights isn't actually mine. It comes from a blogger at the Royal Society of Art after a debate where Richard and Kate were speaking against their critics. And it was a very interesting debate that I was present at, but statistical catfights is one of the summaries of it afterwards. But just, I think the only thing to say very quickly before getting into the meat of it is where we're coming from. Because this is one of those things that sometimes gets misunderstood. And you know, there is this idea that we're coming to throw mud at the spirit level because that's how a lot of the debate has been phrased. So just to say, me and Rob have worked in this area because, you know, we're sympathetic to the argument that inequality causes negative outcomes. We're interested in it, we find it interesting and plausible, but want to explore it. And we're also inspired by the way that Richard and Kate have gone about trying to do public debate, something that takes a certain amount of guts as well as skill that they've both done. So just to flag at the start, that's where we're coming from. But our argument is twofold. So the first part of our argument, which Rob will move on to in a second, is, well, is the spirit levels argument true? What is the state of evidence on this? And secondly, building on this, I'll come back up and speak about, well, has the spirit level politicised scientific debate? So the main way we'll be doing this is we'll be throwing out questions back for Richard and also Kate and also the rest of you in discussion. But firstly, so is the spirit level true?
Okay. So I'm just going to give you a very whistle-stop tour of the evidence, the state of the evidence that exists right now for the thesis of the spirit level. So before I start, I guess it's worth reminding ourselves of what the central thesis of the spirit level is. And I think you can break it down into basically three elements. And the first element is that if you look at the rich countries, the rich developed countries, there are pronounced differences in terms of how well they do in these important social outcomes like crime and health and kind of academic achievement and that kind of thing. And what's more, that those outcomes tend to cluster together. So the countries that tend to do worse, that have, for example, higher crime rates, also have worse life expectancies. They also have higher levels of teenage pregnancy, higher levels of depression, and so on. And that suggests that there is some kind of common underlying explanation. It's not due to some idiosyncratic differences between these countries that's explaining why one country does better in terms of crime rates and one country does better in terms of obesity. There's something underneath that that's explaining why these outcomes tend to be. The second element of the argument is that it's the more unequal countries that tend to do worse. So you can see here, for example, this is teenage pregnancy. You can see that the more unequal countries like the UK and the US are doing much worse than, for example, the Scandinavian countries in Japan. And you can see that again here, just as an example for overweight. And I think this is the main meat of the spirit levels case. But really the central kind of argument that the spirit level is trying to make is that this isn't just an association, that there is a contextual causal effect, a causal psychosocial effect of income inequality on individual people, on the way they think and the way they feel and the way they behave. So people living in more unequal societies feel and behave differently to people living in more equal societies. So a more unequal distribution of income leads to this unequal distribution of status. People are walking around aware that other people are doing much better than they are, and they feel this sense of inferiority. And it's that sense of inferiority that leads them to think differently, to feel more stress, for example, which can lead to poor health, to feel less empathy for other people, to feel less trust, and so on. So what I'm going to do quickly is just go through these points in turn and see what evidence we've accumulated so far for each of these points. So first of all, do these negative outcomes tend to cluster? I think this is the most straightforward one. It's a very easy question to answer. I think it's widely agreed that yes, countries that tend to do worse on some outcomes also tend to do worse on the others. If you know a country's got a high crime rate, you've got a really fairly good bet that they also have a relatively high level of, for example, obesity or low maths achievement or whatever. And there's no real necessary reason why these outcomes should go together. So I think that's a really important plank of the inequality hypothesis that is supported, basically. The next question, which is the main meat of the spirit level book, is there an association between income inequality and these negative outcomes? And I think there's been a lot talked about whether or not these kind of scatter plots that form the main bulk of the spirit level book really accurately reflect reality. A lot of people have said, for example, that Richard and Kate willfully picked only the countries that would show their association and left out those countries that didn't show the association. So I thought what I would do is just quickly just with publicly available data, see if I can replicate their associations. And broadly, it's quite easy to do that. This is a bad place to start, because this is one where it doesn't actually work. But this is the inequality hypothesis. This is the inequality on the x-axis measured by the Gini coefficient. And this is life expectancy at birth. And actually it seems that there's actually a positive relationship here. But that's almost entirely driven by Hong Kong, this very unequal country, which is also has a very long-lived population. You take Hong Kong out, actually there's a negative relationship. With all of the other outcomes, as soon as you start moving away from health, the relationships get a lot stronger. So you look at, here for example, this is infant mortality, the relationship is a lot stronger. You look at teenage pregnancy, there's a much stronger relationship. You look at homicides, there's a stronger relationship. You might think that that might be driven by these outliers. This is Puerto Rico up here, this is the USA. You take those out, there's still a positive relationship. And again, if you look at math scores, this is a weaker relationship, but it's still there. There's this negative association between income inequality and academic achievement. And here, just as last example, this is percentage of people overweight, and there's this pretty strong positive association between inequality and overweight. So I think the case that they have kind of selected their particular countries to demonstrate this association isn't really made. I think they have been fairly transparent in their responses to their critics of how they pick these countries. And I think if you do just pick these countries, I've excluded tax havens and just included countries with over $15,000 per capita GDP. And I think you can see that those relationships hold up. But the question is, do they represent a causal effect of income inequality on these outcomes? And these are just kind of scatter plots. These are bivariate relationships. There could be other things that are explaining this association. There are quite a few that have been suggested. There's a voluminous literature which has gone through various different things that could explain this association. But I think there are some things that we can rule out. I think the idea that we can rule out the idea that it's just that more unequal countries also tend to be poorer. The GDP doesn't really seem to be doing anything. I think we can also rule out the idea that it's because more unequal countries also tend to be more ethnically heterogeneous. I think that's something that's been brought up by, for example, Angus Deaton, and I don't think that that's necessarily supported by the literature. I think we can also rule out the idea that it's because of raw numbers of poor people. That's an argument you also hear a lot, that, well, of course, unequal countries do worse. They have more poor people, and that's where all these negative problems are associated. I think Richard has argued quite convincingly that there aren't enough poor people. There isn't a big enough difference between these countries in terms of the raw numbers of poor people to explain the scale of the differences that we see in these negative outcomes. So, I think the association is there. I think these outcomes do tend to cluster. The question then becomes, what is the evidence for the mechanism? What is the evidence that this sense of inferiority is what's leading people to towards these negative outcomes? I think at the individual level, we're on relatively safe ground. There are many converging lines of evidence which suggest that people who feel a sense of status inferiority are more stressed. They have greater tendency. There's a strong strain in the criminological literature which shows that shame, for example, is a very important predictor of violence. That people who feel status inferiority are less likely to contribute to public goods games, for example. They feel less empathy for other people. There is a strong strain of evidence at the individual level that this is what's actually going on. It's the next step where we try and move that up to the national level, is where we kind of encounter a problem. And the first problem really is that, do we really know that more economically unequal societies are more unequal in terms of their social status hierarchy? I mean, it seems intuitively obvious that they would be, like the bigger the income differences, the bigger the status differences, right? But you can quite quickly think of counterexamples. I think Japan is an obvious counterexample you can think of. It's a relatively egalitarian country in terms of income, but just from an outsider's perspective, it seems to be a country where status has quite an important place in society. There are more overt deference behaviours, for example, towards people who are higher up the status hierarchy in Japan than there are in other more income unequal societies like the US and UK, where you don't see those kind of deference behaviours. The next problem is the problem that Tarani alluded to, which is that we don't know whether it's the national level inequality that people are really feeling, or whether it should be more on the local level. From an intuitive kind of perspective, you would think that it's how badly off you are relative to people that you interact with every day that's important, rather than the national scale of things. And we don't really know. The evidence isn't really in about what's actually going on there. And finally, it's about this number. I'm showing here the Gini coefficient, and that's a number that's often used in the inequality literature. But one number can't capture the overall income distribution. So, for example, if the income inequality is driven largely by a rocketing away of the super rich, does that really matter for the everyday experience of most of the people living in that country? If the super rich are getting much richer, but most of the people you know and meet, their status relative to you hasn't changed, then is that really going to change how you feel about yourself? So let's just quickly summarise what we've got. So these are the facts, or the things I think, not facts necessarily, but the things of which I think we can be reasonably confident. Negative outcomes do correlate with each other. Unequal countries do tend to do worse, and this association doesn't seem to be likely to be due to differences in poverty, ethnic heterogeneity, country level wealth, or the compositional effect of individual income, which is another thing which I didn't mention, but is another thing that's been kind of suggested to explain this association between income inequality and negative social outcomes. Also, we know that feelings of inferiority at the individual level are harmful. So the big question for the Spirit level as a book and for the Spirit level as a thesis is, given these facts, or given these things that we can be confident of, is a contextual psychosocial effect of income inequality the absolutely most obvious plausible explanation for these facts? And I think it's difficult, with apologies to King Richard, I think it's difficult to make the case that it is. I think it's certainly a plausible explanation, but I don't think you can make the case that it's settled, that with the case closed, we know that this is the only plausible explanation for this set of facts. I think there are other explanations, for example, other macro-social factors, for example, public policy, which could lead a country to be both more unequal and to have more negative social problems, which doesn't involve a necessary causal effect of income inequality on the outcomes. And I think basically that's what I'm trying to say, is that there is still this level of uncertainty which we can't get away from. And I think what I'm going to hand over to Ben now, he's going to talk about what we do in terms of people who are interested in inequality and interested in kind of the political argument. How do we go out into the public sphere and make this argument when the evidence is so uncertain?
So, seamlessly, a breakthrough transition. So this leads us on to the question of, has the Spirit level politicised scientific debate? A question that I hasten to add at this stage, I am not going to give you a definitive answer to, but I'm going to raise some questions back. But before I do, I think it's important to be clear of what I mean by politicisation. So, without going into a long and possibly uninteresting tangent that I'm happy to do later about what social science is for, I'm taking it as read that social science is there to do two things. It's firstly there to try and produce a more truthful picture of the social world than other competing sources of knowledge, but it also has a pivotal role to do with social critique. And I think that any account of social science that tries to say only does one of these things is clearly not a good description of what it is we do as social scientists. But then it raises this question of trade-offs between these two things that social science does. And this is a quote from Roger Pielke Jr., who writes a lot about the climate change debate. And as he puts it, scientists seeking political victories through science may find this strategy expedient in the short term, but over the long run, it may diminish the constructive role that scientific expertise can play in the policy process. So this is the thing that I'm interested in considering. In an attempt to kind of communicate these findings, does it risk politicising this particular debate and wider debates that social science can contribute to? And I think there are four potential sources of politicisation. Just to stress again at this stage, I'm not going to argue that the Spirit level has definitely led to politicisation by doing all of these four things. But it's a very interesting case study to consider four really crucial issues, which I think me and Rob feel as young social scientists who see themselves having a public role would like to get some guidance from the rest of you about what we do with. So the first of these is exactly where Rob left us. It's to do with uncertainty. And the points that Rob were making was not that, it wasn't to say there is strong evidence that the Spirit level is false. That's definitely not what we're saying. We instinctively feel that there's something in it, and there are some parts of supportive evidence. But clearly there is uncertainty that remains about potential macro-social confounders and about some of the mechanisms, predictions from the theory that haven't really been adequately tested so far. And the way that I think about this debate is to take what has sometimes been described as a vague Bayesian account of it. Which is to say, what we do as scientists, social scientists, is we have our prior beliefs, and then we have some evidence in front of us, and we combine these two things to come up with what we end up believing after looking at our data. And this is, if you read the kind of philosophy of science, philosophy of social science literature, it's probably the best account of what it is that we do. But what we find in the spirit level, as we find in some other areas, is that we have very strong priors. It's a highly politicized debate. People come to it with strong prior expectations. And we have very weak data. The data is relatively unconvincing compared to how strong our prior beliefs are. And this is, this is a situation that causes us problems. It gives us uncertainty. So having said that, well, is the answer more research then? Is the answer to do more research, particularly on the sorts of things that Rob were talking around, the other possible explanations and trying to rule them out, and also looking at some of these mechanisms and trying to think, can we look in more detail at some of these mechanisms to try and test them? And I certainly think there's a lot of good work to be done in that, some of which Rob is involved with doing, but he hasn't mentioned in his slides, but you can talk to him afterwards about it. It's very interesting. But on another level, it's fundamentally always going to be difficult to get very convincing evidence on this. Partly because when you're dealing with macro-social factors, you cannot run randomized control trials. There is a problem when we talk about, or when some people talk about evidence-based policy, that they have these hierarchies of evidence that rule out ever talking about these large societal level factors. And we don't want to rule out these factors, but we have to accept they're difficult to do research on. And that is particularly the case when we don't know the time lag between the cause and the effect. Because if we knew what that time lag was, we could make use of natural experiments, make use of times that inequality changes quite sharply in countries, and then have a look at what happens. And there is some emerging longitudinal research on the impact of inequality, which again, Rob has done some of. But the trouble here is, we're thinking of effects of inequality that take place over the life course. So they accumulate over long periods of time. There are going to be certain delays in there between childhood impacts and adult outcomes. And it's going to be different for these different outcomes. So in the absence of really having any idea of what to go on with that, we're just left with saying it's very, very difficult to do research on the spirit level hypothesis, to get it so convincing that someone with prior beliefs that it wasn't likely to be true is going to be swayed by it. So we just end up saying, it's unlikely we'll ever have fully convincing evidence on the spirit level. And we can't just say we need to have ultimate proof in order to act on something, because this is the kind of the policies of manufacturing doubt that vested interests will always try and create. So our first question to you, in a sense, is, well, how can we enter public debate in areas where evidence is highly uncertain? Thinking through the spirit level as a case is. So there's three other questions to come back to, but we're giving them to you as questions rather than as decided answers. Okay, so that's uncertainty and carrying on from where Rob left off. But there's a second issue which is to do with consensus. So I'm not going to spend very long on this because I think the point is obvious. So the spirit level, one of the reasons that we're talking about it, aside from the fact that it's a high watermark of an attempt to make social science publicly accessible, is that it's been very heavily politicized. There's been kind of these big debates around it, particularly by what I guess you could call right-wing vested interests. Policy Exchange, who are a centre-right think tank, the Taxpayers Alliance, who I won't go into, but assume that most of you know that they're not exactly an independent arbiter of the nature of scientific knowledge. So obviously there's some political disagreement, but there's also some academic disagreement, which is hard to ignore. So I've just picked out three particular examples. One of them is a paper from John Goldthorpe, who I don't know personally, and by reputation is perhaps slightly spiky in certain ways, but is one of the most significant, if not the most significant, British sociologist in recent decades, who expresses some reservations about the spirit level. Lane Canworthy, whose photo is in the middle there, is a kind of wonderful social scientist in the States on various aspects of inequality, and just in a blog said some very interesting things about the longitudinal relationship between inequality and these outcomes, which again was not to argue that they were definitely false, but to cast doubt on how convinced we can be by them. And then lastly, Karen Rowlingson, who's a professor of social policy at Birmingham, did a report for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who really cannot be said to have a vested interest in opposing the spirit level, supporting large amounts of what Richard and Kate were saying, but again saying, the evidence is not certain and there is no consensus here. So I think, to be fair, to be clear on what I'm saying with academic disagreement, there are very few credible accounts that say there is strong evidence against what Richard and Kate are saying in the spirit level. But there are differences of opinion on how strong the evidence is. There is no academic consensus here, in other words. And the question is, well, we're very rarely going to get academic consensus around these important macro-social issues, partly because of the uncertainty, which is the first point I made. So, how do we as social scientists enter public debate in the face of this sort of dissensus? So, uncertainty, dissensus. The third point is something I haven't thought of a good single snappy word for, so I'm calling it the assertion of scientific authority. So just to kind of turn that into something that might make some more sense. So these scatter plots are the things, Rob was showing versions of this. This particular scatter plot here, with income inequality on the horizontal axis and the index of health and social problems on the vertical axis, has been widely influential, and I think has been an important way of popularising the book's message. I was just checking out the TED site earlier from Richard's talk, and there can be few social scientists who've managed to get 1.5 million hits for an online video. So in some sense, these have been effective. But perhaps, the thing I will most strongly say as an aspect of disagreement is the way that these were presented in the book. So this is a quote from Richard from the Royal Society of Arts event that generated that post at the start of this. So, Richard said, all of these attacks are based on a complete misunderstanding of what we were about. We took relationships that had been largely established by other people's work on other groups of countries or states, and we looked to see if they could be demonstrated among this group. And Kate said something similar on a Radio 4 More or Less program discussing this. And I think that it is difficult to present things as if they are evidence, and then to row back from them and say, well, we never meant for these things to be convincing. In fact, we're relying on an established body of work. There are other bits of work. I think me and Rob both found some of Richard's previous books on this very persuasive, and maybe that's because we're academics, and this was a book that was very firmly aimed at public debate. But to present these scatter plots, it was unclear what status they had in the argument, and many people found them unconvincing. And the response that they were never meant to be fully convincing, less so. Another aspect of this is around where this debate takes place. So this is the start of the Reply to Critics website. So in order to distinguish between well-founded criticism and unsubstantiated claims made for political purposes, all future debate should take place in peer-reviewed publications. And, the reporting of this showed, I have a quote from Spiked online here, and for anybody that doesn't know Spiked, they're kind of nuts in a libertarian way, so I'm not saying I agree with them. But there was a certain amount of resentment at the idea that you can move into public debate to make an argument, and then when people try and respond in public debate, to say, well, we're only going to have responses in peer-reviewed publications. But I think this represents a difficulty, and something, a difficulty I don't really see how we resolve, that again we would like Richard and Kate and your guidance on, is how do we move away from academia, from having certain standards of debate in peer-reviewed publications, into the public sphere, while avoiding what can only be described as non-scientific mudslinging from people who have vested interest. It's very unclear how we avoid, what we're talking about this, and very much can see why you would say you wouldn't want to have further debate outside of peer-reviewed publications. And then a final one just on is versus or, and then I will wrap up over the next 3 minutes or so. So again, without going into the philosophical details too much of it, I think it's possible to distinguish between a statement that is a factual statement about the world and a prescriptive statement about what we should do, to separate an is from an or. And you can do this without maintaining that factual statements are value-free. There is still a difference on the role of values within these two things. And in fact, the spirit level, the impression given is that there was a strong attempt made not to have a program of policy prescriptions at the end of it. There are no kind of concrete recommendations in that sense, and there were much stronger efforts made by Richard and Kay to engage with all political parties than I would say that most of us in this room have ever made in terms of our research. But it was still treated as if it had a political agenda. It was still treated as such by the political opponents and a variety of commentators in the media. It was just perceived to be a kind of left-wing tract in a sense. Possibly because, even if it wasn't very detailed in the policy prescriptions, it did say very strongly, no, the evidence shows that reducing inequality is the best way of improving the quality of life for all of us. So, there is a difficulty here. I think the Spirit level makes much stronger efforts to distinguish between is and ought than most of us do in our publishing arrangement. But even so, there were problems about whether it was politicised because it was perceived to have a political aspect. So, how can we enter public debate without conflating is and ought? Just a few things to finish on. 2 minutes will be fine if I talk very, very quickly for the next short amount of time. I've said that possibly these things will contribute to politicisation, but they're difficult, and we can see why in most cases we would be tempted to move in this direction. And a further thing about it is that the politicisation of science may be inevitable. As Dan Sarowitz puts it, if everyone politicises the science, maybe there is something about science that lends itself to being politicised. And the three things that are clear here is that uncertainty and dissensus are inevitable in the sorts of social science about macro-social factors we're looking at, that public debate and policymakers are both incredibly bad at coping with uncertainty. All of us have had that pressure of trying to, take out those caveats on what you're saying when you're trying to go into a public role. And clearly, where facts matter, there will be vested interests that want to contest them. So I don't think it's possible to say that there would be no politicisation whatever we did. But maybe there is, that there are certain issues where we are more likely to get closure than others. And by closure, I mean that the strength of the data is sufficiently strong to convince people with a wide range of prior beliefs to end up in a reasonably similar place at the end. I do a lot of things on the benefit system. A lot of what the public and policymakers think about the benefit system is just wrong and can be shown to be wrong by anybody who's reasonably intelligent who looks at the data, no matter where they're starting from. And I'm not going to go through that quote, I don't have time, but I can come back to the parallels with the climate change debate as another debate where perhaps in some aspects there is a higher degree of closure than we get here. So just final thoughts then. We think that the Spirit level is a critical case. It's a critical case for us because I think Rob and us have read Richard's previous books and been really, really inspired by them. And this is something that matters a lot to us. It's an important thesis. And I think, as I said before, the Spirit level as a book, Hayden Richards' book, is the high watermark of academics trying to make their complex ideas publicly accessible. It's sold incredibly widely and the videos have been widely publicised. They set up a charity to do its work. It's clearly an important case study in its own right, but it's also a case study of something, of the way that we go about engaging publicly. And, in these issues where our prior beliefs sometimes dominate over the evidence in front of us that really is not so strong. And I think we feel there is sometimes little guidance to social scientists that are trying to have a public role on what we do in these situations, on how we deal with these inevitable trade-offs and conflicts, rather than what usually happens is people arguing about whether social science is value-free and should stay out of public debate, which is clearly wrong, versus those people who say there's no such thing as truth and we should engage in deconstruction, which again I don't think is a defensible account. How do we do these trade-offs? So, our questions to you, just to summarise. The scientists have responsibilities around the way they engage in public debate, around the assertion of scientific authority, over the representations of uncertainty and consensus, and over their calls to action, and using the Spirit level as a way of thinking this through. And just to emphasise again, we don't think we have answers to any of these things, and we would very much like your help, Richard and Kay, and everybody here, to have a conversation with us that can help us as we go forward in what we're doing. And just to flag at the end, this is the blog that we both co-edit now, and should anybody want to write responses to this, or indeed on anything else, inequality and research related, we're very happy for you to talk about it.